Let's give some tzedakah today, Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the month of Chodesh Tammuz. Chodesh Tammuz, which for us is the month of Geula, the month of redemption. I want to today still continue on what I spoke yesterday about the 28th day of Sivan, about the Rebbe and the Rebbe's when they arrived in 1941 to the shores of America. But I want to share with you a personal story. And you'll understand why I'm saying personal story with the Rebbe while he was in France, particularly in Marseille. My late father, Oliver Sholem, and his entire family wasn't married that yet. They actually fled from Antwerp, Belgium, to Paris, where my father had the privilege to meet the Rebbe. My father was also one of those refugees and his family who fled to the southern part of France, particularly in Marseille. The Rebbe had a cousin by the name of Rabbi Zushe Silberstein, who was a great activist, and he had an orphanage where he simply saved orphans, kids where the parents were deported or the parents had disappeared, and he literally saved their lives. He went through all kinds of difficult moments. There were times that he had proper shelter for them, and there were times that were in very dire straits. Now this story I heard from my cousin, who he himself experienced that. He was also in this home from Rabbi Zushe Silberstein. He was already a little bit older, so he was one of the counselors. And he was telling me that at one point they were actually hiding in a cellar. There were about 20 kids, him as a counselor, and the famine was terrible. He couldn't find food for the kids. As much as he searched, he found a little bit here, a little bit there, but it was a very difficult moment. There were little kids from 1.5 years, 2 years old, crying and desperate, and it was a terrible situation. One day, someone showed up with a number of breads in his hand and tuna cans. He came in there and he started feeding the kids bread and tuna. In fact, the little kids who were crying and who were so disoriented, obviously, he would take them on his lap, tell them stories, and while he was telling them the stories, he would feed them the bread and the tuna. When they asked him who he is, what's his name, he just said, Monsieur. So for weeks, le Monsieur would arrive, breads, those French long loaves, the baguettes as they call them, and cans of tuna, and they were waiting for the daily visit of le Monsieur. In fact, it became already a game that the kids were saying, today's my turn to cry, because then he's going to keep me on his lap. And they were going by who is going to be the next day sitting on le Monsieur's lap. In the late 1950s, my father, Oliver Sholem, decided to go to New York to see the Rebbe, also to visit his mother, who lived in New York at the time already. And he asked one of my cousins to accompany him to Crown Heights to go to the Rebbe on Yechidus, a private audience. So he accompanied my father because he stayed in one neighborhood in Williamsburg, and this is in Crown Heights, father not speaking English, so he was concerned about traveling by himself on the bus late at night, and because Yechidus would sometimes could be 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, so he was concerned about going by himself. So he asked his nephew, cousin that is, to accompany him. He already spoke English, he's more familiar with the area, and he came. So my father invited his nephew, when I go into the Rebbe, why don't you come with me? I know you're not a chassid, but that's fine. You're a Vishnitzer chassid, that's perfectly right, but why don't you come in with me? Get a blessing from the Rebbe. A little reluctant, but eventually he decided he will join. So as my father and my nephew, and his nephew, my cousin that is, came into the Rebbe's room, my cousin suddenly looked and turned and he pointed to the Rebbe, le Monsieur. He recognized that in 1940-41, when they were hiding in the cellar and starving, and someone would come and bring bread and tuna. They never knew how he found out about them, where he found the bread, when it was not so readily accessible, to say the least, and cans of tuna. That was the greatest luxury that ever anybody was able to envision. I said, he looked at the Rebbe, Le Monsieur, it's you. The Rebbe just smiled and didn't react any further. Yes, this Monsieur is saving us from old situations, in the darkest of moments, in the happiest of moments, and he's the one who is saving us today and bringing us into the ultimate redemption.